be a wonderful colloquium. And I think in a way, there's no better timing for a presentation on spectacles of Black embodiment and the precariousness of empathy. There's been such great performances by Kendrick Lamar this week, and also Beyonce at the Super Bowl, and the controversy, right, that sprung up immediately around her performance there. So I'm thrilled to introduce ShaDawn Battle, our wonderful colleague. She's been with us since 2015, January of 2015. We were so fortunate when she came and joined us in the middle of the year, which can be really hard for a faculty member kind of coming in midstream. And she has just always picked up the ball and run with it. She teaches wonderful courses for us in composition and literature, hip hop and rhetoric. She hails from Chicago. As a child, she wanted to be a professional athlete or a trainer of dolphins. And I know that she has kept up the athlete side of that. I know she goes to the gym and plays basketball a lot. I think dolphins are a little thin on the ground here in Ohio. But she also did her studies at Central State, Wright State, and now the University of Cincinnati, where hopefully, fingers crossed, she is due to be finishing up her dissertation. She calls it this thing that she is writing in her bio. As anybody who's written a dissertation knows, it does haunt you daily while you're in the trenches working on it. So this presentation derives from that. And in it, she examines the subversive capacities of mainstream hip-hop. Some people tend to look at hip-hop as mainstream hip-hop that's making a lot of money, as kind of inherently sold out to the system. She sees it as having an inherently subversive quality that she looks at through the lens of anti-colonial discourse, and specifically is always looking for covert and transient sites of subversion, meaning the ways that artists engage in liberatory acts, including colonial mimicry, where they contest the power of white supremacist forces, sometimes by engaging in strategic mimicry of those forces. So I'm really interested in learning more about this argument. She has 2 publications already, which is very impressive for somebody still in the PhD process. The first on Jay-Z, in the book Jay-Z Essays on Hip Hop Philosopher King, edited by our very own Julius Bailey. And her essay in there is titled The Self-Reliant Philosopher King, Sean Carter Exonerated. And her second publication is By Any Means Necessary, Kanye West and Hypermasculine Construct. And that is also published in one of Dr. Julius Bailey's essay collections. So, without further ado, I want to give ShaDawn the stage. And so give her a round.
Thank you, Dr. Asplin, for a fine introduction, and thank you all for being here today. You could have been anywhere else in the world. Instead, you chose to attend a talk on Kanye West, who isn't exactly a poster child of good deeds. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to begin by explaining the image before you. So it's a chalk etching of an imbricated portrait of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice, right? And it's made out of paper that's made out of asphalt. And it's the title, Asphalt and Chalk, right? And it's by an artist named Titus Papar. And I went to see the exhibit this summer at the Cincinnati Arts Museum, and it really resonated with me, and I'm using it here today for its socio-political implications with respect to my project here. And I think number one, it represents the ways in which black maleness and black masculinity has been sketched into being and invented. But it also, for me, demonstrates the ways in which blackness itself sort of signifies an undifferentiated mass of flesh to be destroyed and imposed upon, right? And so these 3 young men, they represent how, black bodies, or the viability of black bodies, and all that comes with it. And that's essentially, what my project is about today, right? Unpacking why that happens and what our response to that suggests. Okay, so I'll just leave the terminology up. All right, so what I'm presenting is a fourth of a dissertation chapter, and it's really in its embryonic stage, so admittedly some of the arguments require nuancing. And I think I leave the bulk of the methodology stuff out of this talk. So if you have any questions about methodology, you can ask me at the close of the reading. And so my topic then is why we respond the way we do to spectacles of Black death. And my analysis is informed by a literary scholar by the name of ShaDawn Hartman. She has a book, Scenes of Subjection, and in it she too looks at scenes and spectacles of Black death, Black pain, and Black suffering, right? And in it she argues that our response to what she calls ravaged bodies is emblematic of what she calls a precariousness of empathy, given the proclivity to, reproduce these spectacles over and over, right? So while she's looking at the context of slavery and post-emancipation discourse, I want to extend her observation into a contemporary context. So I feel like I'm constantly bombarded with these sort of spectacles of Black death, right? Most recently, the Chicago team, Laquan McDonald, right? So that video is circulating just left and right, especially on CNN, and of course the infamous at Fox News. And I'm not even going to reproduce or attempt to describe that video, because what Hartman argues is that, we're sort of inured to pain by virtue of the familiarity of these things. But then there's also the image of Trayvon Martin and the 2-second execution video of Tamir Rice. And I think for me the quintessential example would be Mike Brown, right? The spectacle of Mike Brown's body in Ferguson on the ground for 4 hours, right? Okay, so, all right, so what's at issue here then is the media's easy and wide-scale dissemination of images of Black suffering and Black death. So the questions I pose then are, why are spectacles of Black suffering and disembodiment exploitable and desirable to the point of fetishization and even voyeurism? Why are secondhand accounts reiterated with such casualness and perpetuity? And if the answer is a lack of empathy, why is that the case, right? I see the precariousness of empathy as inextricably tied to the construction of Black citizenship in America. All right, particularly, I think that Black citizenship is premised upon the sort of dispossession of Black subjectivity and the denial of Black ontology. Right, and I see this as consistent with the integrative policies that define the organizational structures of colonial and post-colonial societies, right? And if I can simplify that a little bit, basically, the proliferation of these images, right, suggests then, if not a lack of empathy, then the precariousness of empathy, right? There's ambivalence there. And I want to look at this through the ways in which Black bodies are sort of grafted upon the national body, right, in such a way that they are divested of their humanity, of their personhood, and of their ontology. And I look at this conundrum through an anti-colonial and post-colonial lens, right? So I'm applying Fanonian theory of non-alterity. So if alterity connotes otherness, then non-alterity is being outside of otherness. So I talk about what that means. And then a Francophone theorist he describes the organizational structure of the colonies through something called a Hegelian tradition. Right, and I demonstrate the ways in which that also constitutes a sort of non-alterity, and then I tie this together with discursive fabrications, right? So how are these sort of epistemological falsehoods? How do they work in the service of sort of solidifying both of these paradigms? And then ultimately, I look at the way in which these things emerge in the work of Kanye West. Okay, so 1 second. All right, so. But why look to art to make sense of material conditions of Black embodiment? ShaDawn Hartman defers to the quotidian as she examines sites of terror in her refusal to, quote, exacerbate indifference, end quote, to the ravaged body. Likewise, I look elsewhere, not necessarily to the mundane, but to art to give expression to the intersecting politics of the commodification of Black suffering and the attendant lack of empathy, as well as the negation of Black ontology. Right, so I explain elsewhere why I'm even using Kanye West, right? I think that's the looming question. So why use this guy who's perceived to be or to have this sort of counter-revolutionary ethos, right? So after all, this is the same guy who said he would stick a civil rights fist right inside of a woman. So obviously he's a problematic figure. He's misogynistic and, you know, deeply hedonistic, and so he has his issues. But to be brief, though, I think that his art encompasses political utility, right? Insofar as if you really look deeply, there are like submerged sites of contestation, right? There may be like really fleeting moments, but I think that what he offers can be wielded in the context of Black liberation politics on this side of the Atlantic, right? All right. I know you said you wanted to hear more about colonial mimicry, but unfortunately,
Okay.
unfortunately,
Yeah, Q&A.
I'll probably only be able to provide like a cursory glance at the ways in which he sort of, I think he gauges in mimetic performances, right, in his work, and I think that that allows him to sort of reclaim Black male subjectivity so that it's no longer susceptible to the precariousness of empathy, right, and deeper ramifications of that. All right, so I'll jump into the body finally. So, in my attempt to illuminate why there's a precariousness of empathy, again, I'll look at the construction of Black citizenship in America. In contemporary American discourse on Black citizenship, there's oftentimes a preoccupation with disenfranchisement and the curtailment of civil rights, when in reality, central to the construction of Black citizenship in America was and still is the dispossession of humanity and the denial of subjectivity, right? So there might be an inclination to trace this negation to the 1857 Dred Scott decision, right? So Chief Justice Taney declared Black rights untenable, right? And I think he said that the basis for that is that, you know, Black bodies at that particular moment in time, you know, were property, right? But while this is a defining moment in the construction of Black citizenship, I would not say that it's an inaugural moment, all right? So from an early phenomenological perspective, the Middle Passage, according to critical race theorist of Hortense Spillers, marked a, quote, theft of the body, a willful and violent severing of the captive body from its motive will, its active desire, whereby the body is given up as a being for captor, end quote, which Spillers maintains is a, quote, absence from subject position. In other words, right, from the moment or during the Middle Passage, right, those bodies were severed from their desires, their natural desires, and their existence was sort of predicated on the needs and the desires of the captors. Therefore, right, they lost their subjectivity, right? And so from the moment of rupture, ontology was denied. So that's the first instance. But also, the dispossession of humanity owes to the fact that enslaving and colonizing missions relied upon what Alexander Wahili describes as a, quote, governing conception of humanity as synonymous with white Western man, end quote. It follows then that citizenship was not conferred to any body or entity barred from this monolithic construction. Right? As per liberal humanist discourse, any corporeal entity outside of it was relegated not just to alienism, but to non-human designation. Therefore, as George Washington Cable made clear, from the moment his blood stained American shores, the status of the African as brutish and unclean and captive and pagan and savage was natural and incorrigible, right? So the African was by nature, he says, this is a quote, and unalterably an alien. In other words, the African was ideologically and discursively invented, right? Which also constitutes a denial of ontology. So then, the discourse then on African citizenship has to be tethered to this notion of dispossession of humanity first, and then of civil rights. Okay. So this paradigm was solidified in the language of the 13th Amendment, given Black persons were sort of always slaves in the context of criminality, right? So if Black corporeality is innately criminalized, it means then that by sheer fact of my Blackness, right, while we pulled over, I was Black, of course, I'm forever enslaved. And today this might mean structurally, systematically, or without pathological constructions. But then this also means that Black folk are perpetually consigned to the realm of non-human designation, given what I've explained before. And this is why Kanye's New Slave resonates with me. I don't really have time today, but basically what he's arguing in New Slave is that the prison industrial complex, turns us or sort of perpetuates the enslaving mission, right? And scholars like Michelle Alexander recently, has argued that the prison industrial complex is the new Jim Crow, right? And then what does that mean, right? So if the new Jim Crow is sort of this postmodern apparatus used in the service of perpetuating sort of the colonial mission, right, then we have to think about how the colonial mission itself was rooted in this idea of dispossession, right? So, you know, Kanye's work is instructive for me to say the least. Right? He might not be a revolutionary, that might be a stretch, but I will say that he does at least stub the toe of a power structure. All right, so now I use post-colonial theory to further explicate this issue. So this denial of human rights and subjectivity lends itself to a discussion of colonial alterity. So here I'm borrowing from Frantz Fanon's theory of non-alterity, which is the idea that the colonized African was denied entry into otherness, given the Lacanian theory that I is an other, which presumes that otherness grants one access to subjectivity. Right, so basically that means, right, so Fanon would say that through something called first-person consciousness and second-person consciousness, right, the African has an initial perception of himself or herself as a holistic being, right, as a body and soul. And then second-person consciousness is the African understanding himself or herself as a subject unto himself, right? So that means his customs and his habits, right? That means that any non-African is other, right? So therefore, otherness grants one access to subjectivity, right? So then, so the black man then is there, not I, right, to prevent this from happening. He's outside of that. So he's not I, nor is he not I, right? So he's sort of outside of this polemic. Rather, the colonizer is forced to inhabit what Fanon calls, a quote, the static ontological space of the timeless primitive, and is disenfranchised of his very subjectivity, end quote. So Fanon says that he's locked in a suffocating reification of blackness and objecthood. So in this light, the earliest Africans were not cast as other in the American political body, for that would have allowed for ontological and cultural intelligibility, or access to human recognition ultimately. As such, it was erroneous to conceive of the auction block as a dehumanizing spectacle, and one deserving of mourning, given the inanity of mourning for the brutality unleashed upon an object, like when was the last time you grieved for a pencil or something, right? So if black bodies have been denied personhood, why then should we bemoan the spectacle of Trayvon Martin's ravaged body when he was a lifeless intellect? Not just in the gated community in which he was visiting, but in the exclusionary community made up of the modern Western man master subject, right, prior to his murder. All right, so that's the first paradigm, this idea of non-alterity, being outside of otherness so that you don't have access to subjectivity. Then there's something called the Hegelian tradition. So the African is also prohibited from entering the ranks of humanity and subjectivity through his animalization. This is implicated in what one Cameroonian theorist, Echelis Mbembe, refers to as the Hegelian tradition in his defining of the organizational structure of a colony and a post-colony. In this tradition, animalization is constituted vis-a-vis an understanding of the colonized as nothing more than a disposable, what he calls a body thing, belonging to a, quote, sphere of objects, end quote. Mbembe explains that the colonized, quote, can be destroyed as one may kill an animal, end quote, and that the manner and fact of death are inconsequential. This description of the African as a disposable body thing eerily summons spectacles of black disembodiment witnessed today in America. Take the images and narratives surrounding the death of Mike Brown as a case in point. Notwithstanding his mom's desire for her son's body to be removed from the ground, he remained a spectacle for hours, a mere hyper-visible yet invisible mass of dead flesh. Right? So he was a body thing that was also animal, and as an animal body thing, Mbembe argues that in the colony, the, quote, corpse remained on the ground, a material mass and mere inert object, consigned to the role of that which is there for nothing, except in this case, his body was there for good cause, right? It was there to, in my opinion, to legitimate white impunity. Moreover, this idea of non-alterity and black folks sort of belonging to the sphere of objects is oftentimes concretized through discursive and ideological falsehoods made apparent in the mythic narrative surrounding Mike Brown's death. Here's how. So Officer Darren Wilson, prosecutors and the media, were unrelenting in stripping bare Mike Brown's humanity to unveil the non-human monster within. He was tall, he was big, and what's worse, he made rap songs. So Wilson was well within his rights to destroy this monster thing because, as he testified, it, quote, looked like a demon, end quote, and as he informed the grand jury, it, quote, looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots. Wilson's reductive, phantasmagoric description of Mike Brown as a sort of incredible hawk object animates the Hegelian tradition and the Fanonian theory of non-alterity, insofar as Brown, as animal monster body thing, is denied access to subjectivity and humanity through a discursive fabrication. So how then might the nation mourn such a predator that not only resides outside of the monolithic ideal national body of human beings, but also terrorizes the syndicate? It's simple, it doesn't. But what did happen is that both the denial of ontology and an epistemological fabrication absolved Wilson of his crime. All right. So now I turn to the work of Kanye West, particularly Black Skinheads, to make sense of all of this. So, all right. So here I turn to Kanye to articulate further the contiguity between colonial and post-colonial relations of domination and the integration of Black bodies in America. I have chosen as an object of inquiry Black Skinhead, given that through its visuals and through what Fred Moten would term its phonic substance, it lends itself to a critique of Black ontology. Specifically, it lends clarity to its, quote, non-existence or confinement to the realm of non-alterity. It reifies through performance how the Black body is protean, and that it's said to oscillate between animal, monster, body thing, and disposable raw material, and it demonstrates the discursive and ideological underpinnings of these pathologies, right? And I'll play the video. Alright, so, though an unsettling score of inverted semiotic representations of white supremacy, i.e. a Black skinhead or Black Klan hoods, the video for Black Skinhead is instructive insofar as it serves as a satirical social critique of how within a white imaginary, Black embodiment, Black maleness especially, might be wedged between object and non-human, in this case automaton, and animal. The entire performance is an imbricated critique of this, reverberating in the visual depictions of Black maleness in the lyrics and in the sonic accentuations. Take, for instance, the line, "I'm aware I'm a wolf," as soon as the moon hits, right? So the most discernible evidence of non-alterity lies in the verbal comparison to a wolf. Declaring verbally that he is a wolf after obscuring the faces of both the wolves and the mechanical Black male figure enables a sort of psychic slippage culminating in the collapse of Black ontology and of bestiality. This convergence is expressly evidenced in the scene comprising the simulated clones of the Black male automaton, all bearing striking resemblance to West, who again is aware he's a wolf. Though they are the only visible images at one point, their backs are facing the camera so that viewers are witnessing an undifferentiated, right, abstract, a massive blackness, which again in the Hegelian tradition translates as disposable raw material. Adding to the notion that the automatons are not agential subjects is the fact that their backward-facing position, underscoring the recurring trope of facelessness throughout the video, forecloses an ability to discern any modicum of humanity if one's countenance is the most visible and central signifier of identity and taxonomic classifications. Further, though the pack of wolves are no longer in frame, they were never fully visible in the first place, their barking intensifies during this scene in such a way that the non-human sound they emit seem to derive from the army of non-human automatons. Right, so this is what I'm describing. Okay, so I'll skip that part. So there's therefore what I would consider ontological indeterminacy underway in the performance, which yields such a disturbing conflation uttered later on and then solidified in a racial psyche. That is, the wolves and the mechanized images of the Black male figure are easily rendered indistinguishable in a racist imaginary, relegating both entities to the realm of non-human, right, to non-alterity, and one obviously belongs to that particular. All right, so Charles Mills would consider this a, quote, cognitive dysfunction that is socially functional, end quote, in the service of white supremacy's epistemological ignorance, right? In other words, the mobilization of uncertainty, unknowingness, right, ambivalence stabilizes the racial hierarchy. In this case, right, if Blackness is equated to animality, then white subjects do, in fact, right, rule supreme. It stands to reason that this conflation of black ontology and animality is socially consequential. In a material world, given wolves are typically associated with predatory instincts, black corporeality assumes animalistic character traits, warranting its destruction and inducing indifference or even pleasure to such speculative destruction. And what is worse is that the white supremacist autocrat earns a badge of honor and collects a generous sum from his GoFundMe page. The perversity here is such that white subjects arbitrarily confer upon themselves exclusive rights as recipients of mourning by virtue of their exclusive rights to humanity. As it stands, if this conflation dramatized in Black Skinhead and in the testimony of Darren Wilson, recounted above, does not provoke consternation, then it's proof that within an American pathological psyche, black bodies are divested of their humanistic capacities. And then if one deems this an overreading or an unwarranted analysis, then I refer this person to the lines, they think I'm overreacting, like the black kids in Chirac ditch. And I would urge one to contemplate whether asking a nation to mourn for a teenage body of color riddled with 16 bullets is too much to ask. The racist conscience of America must unlearn this construction of the black beast of burden. It must own up to the consequences of its cognitive dysfunction so that we might finally begin lamenting the destruction of these bodies as well as liberate empathy from the webs of ambivalence. So now I'm moving to discursive fabrications. So it can also be argued that black skinheads' preoccupation with folkloric and mythological creatures is West's attempt to ridicule this white supremacist proclivity to produce discursive and ideological fabrications of black male subjectivity, as demonstrated again in Wilson's testimony, which only further legitimates the non-existence of black ontology. Such an examination aids in the exposure of the veneer of black citizenship in the ranks of modern Western man. In two of his three self-references, West alludes to two popular Western fables, the story of King Kong, and of course, as mentioned above, werewolf folklore. With respect to the former, West raps, they see a black man with a white woman at the top where they're gonna come and kill King Kong. So undoubtedly, these lines are explicit references to the history of white American psychic anxieties against integration. This panic, as in the case of Emmett Till, was racist in nature but also sexualized, right? So it's about miscegenation. Given West's then relationship and now marriage to Kim Kardashian, who is actually Armenian but scripted as white American in a popular culture imagination, such an inference is justified. However, this socio-historic critique of the King Kong invocation would be conceptually insufficient. There are deeper ramifications present that might be unearthed. I argue that the King Kong line is more than a figurative treatment, or can be anyway, of American anxiety triggered by the sight of interracial unions and desire. Right? Instead, I think it can serve as a foray into discursive constructions of black male subjectivity, which abets an age-old dehumanizing project underway in America. Though there have been discrepancies in determining whether King Kong is an African or Orientalist depiction, cinematology scholar Cynthia Erb insists that the, quote, mysterious animal figure, end quote, signifies both, quote, primitivist and Orientalist fantasy, end quote, given the geographical details of his capture. Right? So here she calls to mind Edward Said's colossal project, Orientalism, wherein he argues that the Orient, right, that's what you see here, right, the Orient is but a discursive formulation conjured in an imaginative process of, quote, knowledge manipulation by which the Orient was identified by the West. So that person actually does not exist, right? That would be Said's argument. So the Orient, simply put, is created from a pen stroke, like the King Kong narrative. But this discursive construction can be understood in two veins. The first, as Said observes, when Western writers encountered epistemological difficulties reproducing the Orient in a manner consistent with traditional canonical representations, they fabricated their accounts, like Naval, for instance, of producing epistemological tautologies in the process, similar to the parochial tales positing that a black teen of size is a whole black monster or an aping non-human. The Orient, therefore, became associated with absence, right? Consistent with the denial of ontological intelligibility. Thus, the Orient is outside of non-alterity by virtue of its non-existence, right? And so, essentially, I think we can understand this particular strain of Orientalism through a Foucauldian analysis. So Foucault says, imagine a painter and imagine a model. Right, so he says that at the end of the painting, right, so he says the painter actually never even begun to apply his first brushstroke because what appears before him is actually not there, right? It's conjured, right, from an imagination. So there's absence, right? How is this paradigm reinforced through the lyrics in question and the visual iconography in the video? At no point is the black male figure's face perceptible. It's obscured by a fog of blackness that serves as a surrogate mask. So here, right? So just like a fog of blackness. Even though the dancing automaton is animated in a way that commands the gaze of the viewer, and notwithstanding that its torso is hypervisible, the facelessness and its elusiveness insinuate that there is nothing actually there. So that, like Orientalists, viewers are deceived into thinking they are witnessing black ontology, right? Given that the Orient has been discursively, ideologically, and even performatively conjured and consigned to perpetual obscurity, one might take the video, the visual portrayals, and the lyrics together as a dramatization of this reality, and that it is a deft reminder that this very paradigm manifests in the context of black ontology. And here's how. So if as Kanye believes, white America constructs him in particular, as well as, right, the black male subjectivity in its totality, as the hyper-masculine, bigger Thomas brute that violates the sanctity of white womanhood, which the King Kong lines implicate, as well as the line, "I've been a menace for the longest." The masking of identity is a satirical metaphor for the fact that what white America summoned from the depths of their imagination was absence. It was an ideological and discursive construction, think birth of a nation, that never really existed. Right? So his seemingly healthy marriage to Kim Kardashian might be a testament to this fabrication. Right? And then my final example. So in contrast to the reproduction of absence, even when Western writers like Flaubert, for instance, through an imaginative feat, attempted to represent the Orient as what Said says calls eminently corporeal, as a carnal being, he superimposed upon it extreme animality. That's a quote. Oftentimes envisioning its carnality as quote, grotesque nastiness, end quote. Right? So through him, so though for him it was alive, it was still perversely animal and subhuman and mysterious, such as the colonized, right, in the Hegelian tradition. So this is depicted in the visuals in Black Skinheads. The facelessness and shirtless automaton, especially in its replicated form, is simultaneously emblematic of an obsession with flesh, right, and by extension the human. But upon closer look, despite a fleshly surplus present in the video, its human capacities remain imperceptible given the disfigurement of the flesh. And you can't really see it here. So one op-ed writer describes the skin as, quote, crisscross with strange scar-like textures, end quote. So the parallel and intersecting lacerations to which he refers, I wish I could blow the image up, but if you look closely, right, there are like crisscross and jagged lines like all over the body, right? So the lines, then these jagged lines not only create the illusion of a mysterious animal figure, culminating in the curtailment of human distinction, so that the muscular figure then is no more human than, say, King Kong, right? The crisscross lines that disfigure the flesh are also indicative of the sketching into being of black maleness. So here insert the etched overlaid portraits of Martin and Rice and Brown, right? So in this way, the figure personifies the notion of black maleness fixed in a discursive identity of animality, so that the line, "but there's nowhere to go now," can be transposed in a critique of the discursive fixity of black male ontology, right? And does not merely attest to sort of Kanye's hedonistic pleasures, right? Or, hitting the dead end, which those lines imply. In short, in the same way that Flaubert's revivalist approach to representing the Orient vis-a-vis his obsession with carnality paradoxically creates an enigmatic animal figure of carnal grossness whose existence is actuated through an academic field of inquiry, Wes's overemphasis on the flesh also yields a discursive confinement and a carnal aberration reduced to excessive animality, right, i.e. King Kong, that would think he constitutes excessive animality, and thus non-humanness. So I'll just explain how the King Kong self-reference enables the invocation of the politics of the flesh with the aid of Wes's visual depictions. But now I'll explain this phenomenon in reverse, proving that systems of power don't necessarily function unilaterally, right? It's more so like a tennis match. That is, how exactly might the visual depictions of carnality, right? So we've gone from this to this, how might we go from here to here, right? So how might the visual depictions of carnality lead to a discussion of discursive fabrication premised upon a mythological, mysterious animal figure, namely West's King Kong? This interpretive analysis of the politics of flesh and its susceptibility to dehumanizing impulses is in no way novel. In Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Spillers is invested in the ways in which slaves were, quote, transformed into bare-life flesh, end quote. She posits, quote, before the body there is flesh, that 0 degree of social conceptualization that does not escape concealment under the brush of discourse. In other words, if legal personhood then is constituted through the body and the flesh is sort of anterior to the body, then the captive body and a mass of flesh was susceptible to social constructions which legitimated sovereign rule and authority over it. It makes sense then that Spillers would agree with the fact that, with the belief that, quote, black people were treated as a kind of raw material, end quote, which, as I've explained above, is consistent with the Hegelian tradition. If the fleshy black body can be constructed as object in a national body, as animal or as monstrosity, as brute, as buck, as the Hulk, as King Kong, and thus outside of the domain of alterity, then its brutalization and subsequent disposal is conceptually and socially warranted. Prior to his murder, before Mike Brown, there was first and foremost fleshy matter. And because he was transformed into flesh, Officer Wilson's concocted fantastical narrative was emblematic of the social process whereby the flesh marks a site of emergent narratives. The problem, though, is that this fabrication culminated in the denial of ontology, which, is, as I've demonstrated, exacerbates indifference, right, to the ravaged body, because, again, who mourns for that which is, relegated to non-human designation? Thus, the complexity and the hermeneutic possibilities of the King Kong line cannot be overlooked, insofar as it enables a consideration of the dialectical relationship between the discursive and ideological constructions of blackness, black corporeality, and the politics of the flesh, as well as the political violence and attendant impunity that this collaboration engenders. But such interpretive possibilities can only be excavated in Black Skinhead if one endorses the notion that the visual imagery and discourse, the lyrics, are mutually constituent. Ultimately, to conclude, black citizenship in America is the result of falsified epistemological formulations of blackness and black corporeality, which confined to the realm of confined it to the realm of non-alterity. As Kanye West's art shows us, though this is a fixed construction, it is ironically constituted through the mutability of black embodiment, right? So that it is constantly, and in many cases simultaneously, inhabiting objecthood, animality, monstrosity, and disposability in a race's imaginary, as is the case within a Hegelian tradition or colonial tradition. But oftentimes, the establishment of non-alterity and the dispossession of black humanity owes to discursive fabrications. Albeit like Hartman, I too turn away from actual scenes of subjection. Like I purposely chose not to reproduce the actual videos, right, of Laquan McDonald or Timmy Rice, etc. I'm not suggesting that repression, right, or silence is a solution to sort of engender political annoyance needed to combat this issue of the devaluation of black bodies and the absence of national mourning. Rather, we can look at art, at the abominable genre of rap music, at the work belonging to the international asshole, to give expression to the interconnectedness of the precariousness of empathy and the dispossession of humanity and subjectivity, which defines black citizenship. And in closing, if I could leave closing remarks, I would just say that Kanye makes us smarter. That's it? Yeah.